So I wanted to introduce a reading from Marx actually for our class on the future of work. I thought it was interesting because if we can penetrate the dense language that Marx writes with when he writes, then we see that actually in some ways Marx has some very modern ideas um, about the way that technology is going to cause less employment, and Marx is going to talk about whether he thinks that's a good or a bad thing. Hint: could be good or bad, but ultimately going to be good. So it's a short reading. It's really just a little over 2 pages, but you know this language that Marx uses is very dense. So I thought I might just very quickly explain a couple of the concepts as I understand them, that are going to come up here that could otherwise be confusing. So the first thing is that Marx is going to talk a lot about necessary labor versus surplus labor. Okay, so the way I understand that is that necessary labor is what's necessary to produce things that are consumed, whereas surplus labor is going to go into the production of more machinery that's going to sort of increase future production. So I haven't had most of you for a macroeconomics class, but one thing I always talk about in my macro classes is that investment in a macroeconomic sense just means using your time to produce something that's going to produce more in the future. So, for example, imagine traditional macro example: Robinson Crusoe on a deserted island. Every day he takes a stick and goes and stabs fish to eat them. One day, or over the course of a number of days, Robinson Crusoe might choose to spend time making a fishing net out of some materials, reeds he found or something on the island, rather than stabbing fish. That means that for those days he's going to get less fish to eat because he won't be spending as much time fishing. But later he'll be able to use his net and then catch even more fish. So he's delaying, he's using some of his labor to create something that's going to make him more productive in the future. So I think that's this idea of surplus labor that Marx has. The more machinery there is, the more surplus labor there can be to make even more machinery or more capital. Okay, so that's kind of one of the concepts. A second concept that I think is hidden here that's not so important for the reading, but because Marx brings it up a few times, it's good to just know what he's talking about. So from Marxist theory, or Karl Marx's own theory about value comes from labor. Okay, so these days we would think that value more comes from, the utility people get from consuming something. Or maybe supply and demand would be more typical, it's a market outcome. Whereas Marx here thinks that the more labor there is in something, the more valuable it is. Okay, so he's going to reference that several times. It's not important for the reading, but it will help you to understand what he's talking about in those sentences. So yeah, when you're reading this couple pages of Marx, I want you to think about whether Marx thinks that the development of technology is a good thing for workers or not, or a good thing for society or not, and why he thinks that. So yeah, it's a dense reading. It's short, but I think it'll be something interesting to talk about, again, because this is this famous economist talking about, this economist famous for thinking about workers being exploited. They're building things in factories, but the owner of the factory gets to take it and sell it and only give the workers a pittance. So it's interesting to think about how Marx thinks about labor replacing technology, is whether that's a good or a bad thing. So I'll leave it there.